It's not necessarily a regulatory structure. And really the goal of these programs is to combat the fact that farmers often take an economic loss when they implement what we call regenerative practices or climate smart practices, because it does take a lot more labor and inputs generally to do these sorts of practices on their farms. So the PES type program is intended to cover that gap by providing that payment to a farmer. And how payments are sort of sourced from different funders and how they are distributed varies widely across each of the programs. Generally, we see that these programs intend to compensate farmers for ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration in soils or trees on farms, things like flood mitigation benefits, improved water quality, such as reductions in phosphorus and nitrogen off fields. And historically, they were much more focused on a pay-for-practice approach. So paying farmers to implement a specific practice on their farm, or even to leave their land fallow. So there's international examples, like in Costa Rica at a countrywide level, they've paid farmers to leave their land fallow and keep it under forest. But we generally see that programs are moving more towards what we call a pay-for-performance approach. So that's where farmers are paid for quantifiable outcomes on their property. So how many metric tons of carbon are they sequestering? How many pounds of nutrients are they reducing off of their farms? So we see that there's this general shift towards that method. And in that way, farmers, specifically farmers, can come to their own decision making when deciding which practices to implement. So it kind of can be more context specific, and they can decide, this is better for my farm than doing another certain practice, but I'll still reach those outcomes in the end and get paid for them. And we can see that there's different, structuring of programs. We've seen programs at a very local level, and then programs, as I mentioned, all the way up to a country level. So how they're structured can vary widely across the board. And the program that we've been working on here at CC Tompkins has specifically been working on a pay-for-performance approach. And as I'll get into, we've been working on different methods to quantify ecosystem services on the farms that we're working with, so that we can develop a program long-term in order to fit that sort of category for PES. And here in the Finger Lakes, and I know it seems like a lot of you are different places, so but in the Finger Lakes region, there are programs currently available for farmers to access that are PES programs. A lot of them are more focused on carbon markets. But one thing that we saw in initial conversations around this topic in the Finger Lakes was that while there were programs available, farmers of color and beginning farmers, as well as small farms that have very complex farming systems, things like agroforestry, where you integrate trees into the farm, we're not accessing these programs. So that's where we really started to formulate the idea to pilot a program that was focused specifically on these farms that weren't able to access current PES programs, current carbon markets in the region. And so we really started developing the idea for a regional approach. And at that time, I was a graduate student working with the group of stakeholders that was sort of starting these conversations. I did some work interviewing farmers in the county on PES programs. So part of that work, as well as the stakeholder work, is really what started to drive this idea of developing a pilot here in the Finger Lakes that would focus on that demographic, as well as focus on developing a pay-for-performance program. And if there's any questions at any time, you can also feel free to stop me before the end. So conversations, as I mentioned, have been started around developing a pilot. And from those initial conversations in 2019, what happened was we started developing a group of community stakeholders who were really interested in PES in the Finger Lakes and developing a program that would start as a pilot here in the region, specifically here in Tompkins County, and then sort of branch out to surrounding counties. And really grateful for Nancy, who's been working on our work team with us and who's done some soil sampling since 2022. It's been really great working with you and all the other volunteers. So the work team that we have advises the program development. So they've been meeting regularly since 2020 as a volunteer stakeholder group. And then they were able to secure funding in 2021 from a local foundation. That's how I came aboard as staff for the program. And then we were able to launch the actual pilot program in 2022, where we first started with 6 farmers here in Tompkins County, with the aim to focus, as I said, specifically on smaller farms. So the mean acreage of that first group was 35 acres. The largest farm was 100 acres. And the majority of participants were either farmers of color or beginning farmers. So we've been working with that group of farmers since 2022 to have conversations on, what does a payment mechanism look like? What does a contract look like long-term? How much could a payment be worth your time in a long-term program? So really having these on-the-ground conversations with the farmers that we work with. From there, we were also able to go on each of the farms that we work with to take field samples, sort of building building off of each other since 2022. We've taken soil health samples through Cornell's lab, as well as soil cores. You can see here this picture, we work with Hudson Carbon. They're out of New York State as well, but they were teaching the volunteers how to take a soil core. Here we're talking through taking measurements of tree diameter that would be used to look at carbon stocks in trees integrated onto the farms. So we've been working really closely with volunteers as a community level effort to actually work on the quantification as well. And since then, we've now expanded to have 12 pilot farmers in the program. We're really excited that has now expanded outside of Tompkins County as well. We now work in 3 other surrounding counties with farms there, continuing to focus on smaller farms as well as farms owned by farmers of color and beginning farmers. So now kind of looking forward for the rest of the year. So I think one thing to highlight is that we haven't paid the farmers that we work with for ecosystem services at this point. We have been developing the system to do so. So this year we'll be trialing an actual payment based on the sampling from previous years. We do pay our farmers a community engagement stipend, acknowledging that they take time out of their day, up to 40 hours a year, working with us to do the sampling, as well as have group conversations, one-on-one conversations to understand how we can develop a program that works for them. We'll also be sort of developing this roadmap that we see as sharing the process that we've gone through, which has been a very grassroots, local level initiative, sharing that out so that if there's other regions that are interested in going through the same process, they can follow some recommendations of what might work for their region and be able to make it a little more context specific for them. And then a major, I'm not sure how many conversations you all have had around the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act in New York State. So New York State's climate legislation has a final scoping plan with all the recommendations for how New York State can reach their climate goals by 2050. One of their recommendations in the agriculture and forestry section is that New York State should develop a PES pilot program at a statewide level. So we've been having conversations with the folks that wrote that recommendation to understand how we can share what we've learned at a local level, implementing a pilot for a few years now, so we can understand how we can support whatever process that they would be going through as well. And we're also looking to sort of expand some of the collaborations that we've been doing with researchers specifically at Cornell. We've been working with the Cornell Soil Health Lab and having conversations with economists and hydrologists on campus. But one sort of now really exciting, I think, opportunity that we're looking to do is working specifically with a lab to quantify above ground woody biomass, or any parts of the tree, like the tree trunk, the tree branches, foliage, that can then be calculated to estimate actual carbon stocks in the trees on the farms that we're working with. So as I mentioned, most existing programs aren't really looking at trees in forests or on farmland. So there's forest carbon markets, there's agriculture carbon markets, but that sort of in between has been lost in context. So part of our program is really looking at how we can develop a program that supports farmers who are integrating trees into their agricultural production system. So we'll be working with a professor on campus to use drone LiDAR to actually create a more efficient way of calculating those carbon stocks in trees. So we're really excited about this. The Zoo Lab is also part of a larger New York State project where they've been tasked with developing the methods at a statewide level. So we're excited that anything we're now doing at the local level is really connecting up to, a broader region, statewide initiative, and really sort of lifting the voice of agroforestry in some ways going forward. And so just to give you kind of an idea of how our funding has gone since 2021, we've had a few local foundations that we've worked with, Park and Community Foundation. The Edwards Mother Earth Foundation is a larger foundation out of Seattle. So that's part of a broader agroforestry grant that we've been working on here at CC Tompkins. And then we have had some sort of statewide focused funding. State 224 funding is through the extension system. And then a New York State member line item fund that was requested by a community member. And so a lot of our conversations with our work team have been talking about ongoing funding, and some of the ideas that we've been thinking about have looked at, one, that statewide recommendation by New York State to develop a pilot program and how funding could be potentially sourced from a statewide funding arrangement, and then also looking at community funding opportunities where, here in the Finger Lakes, water is a big resource, or biodiversity could also be another aspect, and sourcing funding from a community level that could be part of this program long term. So I think that's all my slides. Yeah. So happy to take questions, comments, anything at this point. I know I threw a lot of information at you all, so. Yeah,
First, I'd like to
through.
thank Jenna. She did a terrific job of explaining. So if you have questions, raise your hand via Zoom, because I don't see everyone at once. Although it looks like you could just unmute and ask.
I have a question. Sorry.
Oh, good. Go ahead. It's the two Jeans. Go ahead, Jean. I'll ask after you.
I might have missed it, but what are some of the things the farmers would do that you would pay for? I just saw everything you're measuring, but what can you give us an example?
Yeah, so an example would be we're measuring carbon stock, so it could be a change in carbon over time, or meeting another mechanism that we've talked about is a soil health threshold of, if you're reaching certain metrics in soil health, receiving a payment for reaching that threshold continually. Because we are working with farmers who have already adopted regenerative practices. So that's kind of a little bit different than other PES programs that are looking to see a change in practice. So saying, how can we develop a mechanism that's actually rewarding farmers for continually meeting these metrics? So really that threshold approach has been something that has come up in sort of as a way to go about that, so that we're continuing to compensate farmers to reach that level. So yeah, so the threshold with soil health, and then thinking of changes in carbon stocks in both soils and trees. Hope that answers.
Jean, did that answer your question, or were you looking for practices that might do that? I guess that answered her question. Good. Jean.
Great. Yeah, Jean from Arkansas. Right. I have a question. You mentioned other states or other locales doing some of this work. Can you tell us where else this is happening?
Yeah, so one pilot program that we've spoken with is of Ohio. So I can maybe find a link here at some point, called the Upper Scioto PS Pilot Program. That's through American Farmland Trust. So they're looking at water quality benefits and quantifying nutrient reductions upstream from Columbus, Ohio. There's been a lot of talk at the statewide level in Vermont around PES programs. They do have a pay for phosphorus pilot program where they're also looking at reductions in nutrient runoff off farms. So those are kind of the biggest highlights I would say of pay for performance, thinking at a municipal or state level. And then there are carbon markets like the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund works a lot in the Midwest. They look at carbon and water quality on farms, and then they've been doing some work to expand to New York State. So kind of at the different levels, there's options out there currently for some farmers to access.
Great, thank you.
Great. Greg.
Get off of mute there. Thank you for the presentation. I was trying to, and your last answer might have built on part of this question, but it strikes me much of what you're doing is very local in nature. And is that by program design? Is there any effort to say, how could this extrapolate broader? I'm just trying to understand kind of what the sight line is of this program, because what you talked about strikes me as it applies well to the Finger Lakes, and I don't know the area well, but I'm not sure how well it would translate into the Midwest where I'm based. I'm just trying to get a perspective on the program.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And how we've formulated it is thinking of it as a regional approach that is specific to this context. In the Finger Lakes, that could then be potentially piloted in other regions of New York State first. Thinking that even within New York State, there's a lot of diversity in production and farming systems. And so seeing how, a Hudson Valley pilot could work or a Catskill pilot could work. And sorry, I'm throwing out a lot of geography here of different areas, but really the push for this local aspect, I think, is one sort of been built on the relationships with the farmers has been in terms of building a pilot and being able to have those close conversations, especially working with farmers of color who don't necessarily trust the system that we're working with. So being able to have those relationships already built in has been really helpful in pushing forward conversations that can get into, financials or like long-term farm planning that not everyone might necessarily want to share with someone that they don't know. And thinking that we are working with farmers with small farms. So whether that translates more broadly to other regions of the US, I think that's a good question that we haven't answered yet. But I could see a localized approach working in some aspects, and just kind of thinking more about who you're looking to reach, because I think that would change to how you develop a program. And whether there's existing programs that they're accessing. You don't want to build something that maybe they're already accessing in the first place. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you.
Great. Steffi?
Hey, great job. Just wondering if you all plan on reaching out to traditional farmers to get them to move to regenerative with these findings or the results of what you've done.
Yeah, that's a really good question. How we have done outreach, so part of my role is also looking at existing carbon market programs that farmers can access. So having some conversations with larger farms in the area to see, are you interested in this and accessing them? And there's been sort of limited interest at a larger farm level in our area of accessing these types of programs. So we kind of see it as a building the process first, and then there might be more interest in the future, kind of down the road, rather than at the onset of building a program, sort of in co-development and co-creation with the farmers. And also acknowledging that there are programs that help pay for practice implementation to get to that level of regenerative. And so it is part of the work is saying, you know, how can we help you to get to that point with what's existing already? Whereas the program we're building is sort of, you're at this level of ecosystem service provision. How do we keep you at that level? So I think it's an ongoing conversation. One thing we have talked about in terms of the methods is having a conventional farm in the program in order to compare between the two, which would be helpful when thinking, you know, we have farms that are already reaching that threshold, but how does that compare to a conventional farm? So bringing in a conventional farm has been brought up in our conversations. We just haven't moved forward with that yet.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Gary.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks for the talk. Yeah, my question probably kind of builds on some of the things that have been said already. And I'm kind of curious about how you see this eventually scaling up. You know, you keep mentioning pilots in New York and in Vermont and so on. And of course, what we need is many, many, many more farms to get on a program like this. So can you say anything about how you think this might scale in a kind of 5 or 10 year time frame?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of it and how we've been building this program is maybe different than other programs in that we've started off without the buyer identified in a way. So we're working to identify the buyer, and in the long term, that would create a sustainable program going forward. So that is where we have had conversations of how do you, you know, at a statewide level have buy-in to continue this type of program. And that's been with continual conversations on what we've been doing, educating people at the statewide level of ag and markets or in the legislature, say, you know, this is what we were working on. This seems important to the people that we work with. And it does require stakeholder buy-in in the end point. So I think that's where the different scenarios sort of start to play out, that in a 5 to 10 year span, is it statewide buy-in or is it a local buy-in? And that really can have a big effect, I think, on the scaling of it. If it's a local funder, it could be scaled to a regional level. But could it be scaled then beyond that? Probably not. So I think it needs some sort of buy-in from different levels in order to reach that scale. And we've just been in conversations to understand how we can share what we've been doing in terms of that. I don't think that super answers your question, but hopefully it's a lot of unknown scenarios in some ways.
Yeah.
Great. Susan.
Yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate this presentation. It's so interesting to learn about what's going on in New York with ecosystem services payment. This is great. I just have a quick comment on the mechanism for ways to think about delivering this. And this, Colorado just passed a refundable tax credit for regenerative agriculture. And the farm, it's quite substantial, 3 million total per year. And individual farms and ranches can take a credit of up to $300,000 per year, depending on the number of acreage. It's tied to acreage. And, you know, I could imagine that being reconfigured to be tied to some kind of carbon performance achievement. You know, right now, this is a first step for Colorado to have a refundable credit for regenerative ag. The Farm Bureau is a huge supporter of this. So I think traditional farmers may be drawn into this with that kind of supporter. So I just mentioned that, we're still learning about the Department of Agriculture in Colorado is going to roll it out. So we'll see, how this rolls out and how widely it's utilized. But anyway, and the nice thing about a refundable credit is that if the farm doesn't have enough income to generate tax to offset the credit that's been earned, then that excess is paid, it's made as a cash payment to the farmer ranch by the state. So that's kind of a cool, a really interesting aspect of it. But anyway, so that's a comment. But the question that I had was about, you mentioned some statutes, kind of a statutory framework in New York, and I didn't catch the name of that. And I was wondering if you could.
Yeah, I can put that in the chat and maybe find the link. So it's Climate Leadership, Community Protection Act. is
Okay.
The acts, and then it's called the final scoping plan. It outlines all of their recommendations across every sector in New York. So it's not just agriculture and forestry, but there's a large section on recommendations to how to meet those goals that they've set out. And the funding of those recommendations, I think, is still, we've been trying to understand where that is going to be sourced, since the plan has a lot of recommendations that are going to require a good amount of funding in order to move forward. So understanding, the regulatory approaches that New York State will take, or how will they approach developing that funding source. Yeah.
And is that you mentioned state 224 funding? Is that related to what you just mentioned?
No, so that's separate. State 224 funding is through all county extensions in New York. So that was, our board decided they had extra funding and they wanted to allocate it to this program specifically. So that goes to every extension in New York.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Susan.
Right, Ben?
Yeah, Jenna, so I think you had mentioned that the program works with a number of like smaller farms. So I'm in Chicago, and we have a number of urban farms in the area that are definitely small, maybe only a handful of acres max. And I'm wondering, based on what you've experienced so far with this pilot program, maybe what you've seen with some of these others that you mentioned, are there any does this scale to smaller farms, or is this really only a cost-effective program for like a larger farm?
Yeah, so that's one thing that really our methods team has been looking at, thinking about. There is a lack, sort of a research gap when thinking about methods to quantify on smaller farms, especially farms that have, they may be planting rows of trees and then have vegetables underneath. And so when you do the methods, you're kind of thinking about all these complex parts. So part of our work is trying to find that equilibrium of, sampling costs versus, how much money is then going to the farmer from the program. So it is like a work in progress. And, a lot of that has been thinking about the soil carbon aspect of, it would be more efficient and easier to take these samples on a 2,000 acre farm that is doing the same thing across all of those acres. So finding that equilibrium point between the two is something that's still being worked on. So I think that does affect, how fast a program could scale up rapidly. Just thinking about, that's a question that needs to be answered while building the program. In terms of the smaller, like even smaller farms of what we've been working with, one thing that has come up in terms of the methods is saying a lot of this work uses GIS mapping. So, how big does a farm have to be in order to use that sort of data collection? And in GIS, it's like a 30 10 by 10 meter squares, which comes out to about half an acre in order to actually map things out and do analysis on it. So we've kind of seen that the smallest farm could be half an acre if in a program, but anything less you wouldn't really be able to do the same analysis. So that's also been part of our conversation, because we had some urban farms that were interested, but we were able to work with our soil consultant. They said, you know, it has to be at least half an acre in order to do the analysis. But I mean, maybe other options for urban farms in terms of quantification, or just maybe a pay for practice approach then works out better. So I think just thinking about the context is always helpful too with that.
Okay, so some of the other ones you were talking about, like measuring carbon stocks, is that more like performance based?
Yeah,
Okay.
so that would all be measuring, you know, how much carbon is being sequestered, and then a payment based on that. Whereas, you know, if you pay for practice, you can say, I'm going to pay you this much money to plant cover crops, or this much money to do no-till. So that's sort of the other half of the approach. But then farmers are told kind of what they have to do in order to get that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Paul.
Thanks, Jenna, for the presentation. I'm actually, these questions raise more questions, but anyway. So a couple of things. I'm presuming right now your funding source is just all coming from grants, or do you have some buyers already lined up to pay for some of this? So that's one question. And then kind of related to that, which you were just talking about, and that is the methodology of payments for performance. Is that based on some model that you've created? Are you using something like the CARS carbon registry system for determining your payments? Since you're using satellite imagery, I'm presuming that's your method, is trying to figure out some way to measure. And then I appreciated the payment for like getting to a certain level and staying there, because that's the weakness in this whole discussion, is long-term people, whether it's maintaining trees or buffers or no-till or whatever, are kind of being left out of this whole discussion. And in fact, they've been providing ecosystem services free to society for years, and nobody wants to pay for that. They just want to pay for new stuff. So questions, funding sources, and then what's your methodology for determining the payments for those?
Yeah, it's two really great
Yeah.
questions, Paul. So first, yep, the funding we have right now is all grant-based, so we don't have a technical end buyer. So we do have one of the foundations that we're working with is providing funding to do the trial payment. So even though they're not going to be a long-term buyer, we've spoken with them that we'll be trialing a payment through that funding. So we'll be able to, you know, trial payment and then talk with farmers about what that payment looks like, which I think is a really helpful stepping stone to then share out with a potential buyer. But our funding and policy group has been looking at different funding sources and starting conversations with those potential funders. So some local people, as well as that statewide conversation of how does this fit into any statewide situation. We have had conversations with the farmers we work with, and they're not very interested in doing or working with like a private carbon market sort of scenario, like having a large company come and pay offsets to them. That's just, and this is a context specific thing, but it's very, very values based. So they're not interested in working in that sort of sphere. So that's still a question that we've been working on as we move forward. In terms of the methodology, that is, so there are existing methods, as you mentioned, with different registries. But since we are working with smaller farms with more integrated systems, they don't necessarily translate well to the farms that we work with. So it's been a process of building a methodology, kind of taking lessons learned from those registries, as well as working with the researchers that we collaborate with to actually build a methods that works for the types of farms that we work with. Because this is kind of a larger question that a lot of people are working on. So we're kind of trying to make connections as much as we can with the folks that are saying, you know, there are small farms out there, the methods aren't working for them. How do we get enough boots on the ground, taking samples and developing an actual method that works? So we part of our methods, we use different data layers in order to identify sampling points. And then we have volunteers go out and actually take the soil core. So it's a lot of in-field sampling, as Nancy knows, a lot of hard work to get those samples. So thinking about how that can be more efficient is the ongoing conversation with us. Because there's a lot going on in these farms, so it can be a challenge to quantify in an efficient way.
Yeah, and we're in New York, so there are a lot of rocks on the farms. So we tried to have, what was it, 36-inch, 40?
We had 1 meter cores, and
1 meter cores.
those did not work. So this is where you see it's like a piloting, testing out process where we tried the 1 meter cores and they were not going to work. So now we're doing the 30 centimeter cores going forward. But still, New York has a lot of rocks, so we're region specific. It can be hard to collect some of this data on some of the farms for sure.
Yeah, I just saw on that note, I just read a research paper not too long ago that basically about 2-foot cores, you'll have to translate that into centimeters, but 2-foot cores would be adequate. And I talked with Indigo about it, and they're actually at can't remember what they were at, like a foot or something like that, but they were just analyzing carbon in the top 12 inches or so as their basis, as opposed to the deeper cores. And a lot of, at least in North Dakota, the 2-foot is the standard soil sampling protocol. And so that was one of the things I suggested they look at. If that's the standard soil sampling protocol, when we're sending in our samples for analysis every year, we could add the carbon, soil carbon measurements to all of that, whether it's for the entire core or for top 6 and then 6 to 24. And that would be a long-term database. And I actually started doing some of that just for fun and to see how much it cost on the soil cores I pulled this spring. So it would fit into just a normal practices, as opposed to having to have special things going on in the field to gain that information.
That's awesome.
Great. Pamela.
I am wondering how this is similar to CRP and different from CRP. And also I saw that there's a big USDA government thing coming through that's oriented toward climate change. I think it's called GROW, the acronym. I can't remember, or is anybody familiar with that? And I'm just wondering, I've been meaning to talk to the USDA here and see if they have a clue what's going to be coming from that. But it's supposed to start hitting the offices soon, I think. One other thing I have as a suggestion is for funding, try the Jeremy Grantham Foundation. He's a multi-billionaire who's very interested in climate change, and he is funding at least one place I know of that's focusing on agriculture. And so that could be a source to get more funding for it. And I also agree with I'm an old new farmer. I started at 68. And my whole thing was I couldn't find anybody to do regenerative agriculture for me. So I moved up here from Texas to do this, which was a crazy thing. But anyway, one of the things people have brought up about as things keep developing, and the Colorado idea that if your farm doesn't make a profit, because mine ain't gonna make a profit for a long time, that would be really nice to have something like that, that if if you don't use a tax break, you can pay for it anyway if you're doing those practices. So those are my questions. Sorry, there's so many.
You know, I think I got the first one, so I might need to run around the second one, but so how is this similar to CRP? Or not, or how different? I think you're saying CRP being the Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to keep lands out of production for a certain amount of time. And then they have the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, where they are paying, and this is sort of in a similar sense to PES, and you know, whether it's defined as PES, I think can change based on the person you're talking to. But in the Conservation Stewardship Program, they're paying you to maintain your stewardship level and then to still do additional practices. So it is practice-based, where they're giving you a payment based on the acreage that's under that new practice. And they have all the practice standards and sort of the payment rates for those practices. So in that way, it's different, and that's very practice-based. It's still a conversation of, you know, what practice are you doing? Are they within the NRCS standards? What do you want to do that's maybe additional to that? And it's less quantification based. So not saying, you know, we're going to pay you for the metric tons of carbon sequestered. It's we're going to pay you to do this practice. And it is a really great program in that it's helping farmers reach that additional step, and providing in its own way a maintenance program or maintenance payment for at least the 5-year term for the farmers that access it. So I think sometimes it's a question for a farmer of like, do you know, maybe there's a practice you really want to do, and it's under NRCS and we can get you funding through that. And there's a lot of funding coming through at this point for farmers to go into CSP or EQIP, being the other sort of conservation practice program. So similar in that way, but much more practice-based for farmers.
Are you familiar with my second question? I think it was second, was the new, I mean, it's like the Biden administration has put a chunk of money to the USDA, and it's for climate change practices related to agriculture. Are you familiar with that?
I haven't heard of any called with Grow, but I've another sort of big funding stream.
I could be remembering it wrong, but
No,
go
that's
ahead.
okay. There's like so many acronyms with USDA and all these. So another funding source that has like farmers have been accessing now for practice implementation is called the USDA Climate Smart Commodity Grants. So there's I think 141 projects across the US that the USDA is funding for 5 years. They're all pilot programs focused on implementation of climate smart practices and then sort of developing that later on market mechanism. So is that a premium for the, you know, for the product because they are using climate smart practices? They are doing some measurements depending on the program. A lot of them are using what's called Comet Planner or Comet Farm to quantify estimates of carbon sequester with the practices. But again, there is a very much a practice change focus in that they're, depending on the grant, it differs which practices they're incentivizing. But there's a lot of big projects out now for funding, and I can find that link. So you can actually look at a statewide level, which projects are available for farmers in your region. So one thing I've been working on is understanding how farmers can access them in New York State. Because there's almost 30 projects in New York that farmers can access. So that's another sort of big funding stream that we see available for farmers. So a lot of, you know, extension work is understanding how to navigate that and then support farmers through the process, because it can be hard for someone who's working in this every day to sort of navigate it. So understanding for us is a big part of the work as well. So yeah, that's another big funding stream.
Well, and then there's the money from the Inflation Reduction Act
Yeah.
that is specific for the conservation programs, but climate smart practices.
Yep.
Because there are other practices that are within the conservation programs as well. And I read somewhere that it changes the 1/3 of applications, appropriate applications were funded before. This would allow 2/3 of the applications to be funded for those programs, EQIP, CSP, ASAP, and those. And now there's a question about putting it into the Farm Bill and whether that would be reallocated or not. And it differs between the House and the Senate.
Well, it might be part of the Inflation Reduction Act. I don't remember. It was just a huge wad of money coming to the USDA.
It was 19.5 billion. That's a big wad.
Yes, it really is. The other thing that I mentioned was Jeremy Grantham's foundation, the Grantham Foundation. Have you all worked with them at all?
I haven't. I'm going to make a note to look into them as well. Thank you for sharing.
They're really interested in this, and I think they're working actually with two organizations. One's the Savannah Institute in Illinois. I can't remember the name of the other organization. It's, I think, in North Dakota, where they're doing a lot of research on regenerative practices.
Oh, cool.
So
yeah.
They're very interested in it, and they have lots of money. So
that's good to know. Thank you.
They're doing a lot of different climate change things, but they have a big foundation to try to make a difference.
Thank you.
Thanks for your presentation.
Great. Gary.
Hi again. I'm not a farmer. I had a farm when I was a kid. It was a lot of fun. But, I wonder the things that we're talking about in terms of, these practices, no-till, other things that farmers can do, increasing carbon content in their soil. What I've heard is that the more carbon you have in your soil, the better off you're going to be. I mean, presumably up to some limit, but and you mentioned early that just adopting these practices, farmers have to kind of get over this hump, and there's some additional expense as they convert to these practices. But I mean, eventually their land begins to improve, and I wonder whether there's a premium that they realize because whether it's, eventually they are able to get by with less labor, or they're able to get by with fewer inputs, or they're able to sell their goods at a premium because, well, this is all regenerative or it's organic or whatever it might be. And where these payments really become kind of superfluous, or they end up being, just things that they don't really need anymore because, they are able to do the economics, and again, their land is improving, and so they make out better. So I'm just wondering, like, is there any truth to any of that, or will we always have to be paying farmers to adopt these practices?
That's a good question, Gary. And yeah, I don't know if I have the definitive answer on that. I guess I can say that there has been work done, at least with American Farmland Trust in New York State, to look at the economic benefits of soil health and do some case studies for farms to show, there might be an economic benefit to making this switch in the long term. In terms of sort of how we framed it, I think an important consideration is, and an unknown, is especially around that question with agroforestry systems, and saying that when you first plant a tree, you're leaving it in the ground and it's not going to produce something for, 7 to 8 years. After that point, theoretically, it will be producing and you'll be making you know, money off of that tree in terms of what it's producing. Can you get a premium off of it? But that first 7 years, you're not making any money. So that's where a lot of the PS, you know, thinking has evolved in terms of specifically in agroforestry, of that sort of time between planting and harvesting. But I don't think we have the answer yet to then at that point. Is it still worth their, you know, the farmer's time in terms of production with that whatever premium that they could be getting, or is it still so labor intensive that it's not going to be enough just the selling of a product? So I guess my answer for that is maybe a call for more in-depth sort of research or case studies with farmers that have gone through that process, and understanding, is it still worth their time? You know, I'm working with one farmer who is thinking about trialing no-till, and they're looking at exactly that, you know, how much labor is going into this, but how much better is will my soil health be? How much more will I be producing potentially? So it seems like it's an ongoing conversation and could be specific to a farm, but at some point maybe we'll have more sort of a generalized answer to it. Hope that
Okay,
helps.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question from Alan.
Thank you. Interesting conversation. I appreciate it. One gentleman mentioned, and I'm not sure I remember this correctly, I'm trying to remember correctly, is will these programs that go on, will they be just continuous, that you have to give farmers money, just it's an ongoing process that will never end? But, well, it seems like this is ignoring what has been accomplished in certain areas. There's one farmer in this Illinois-Indiana border area. His name is Rick Clark, and I think he's been mentioned in relation to this Nancy's program and her work is, and he has data and details of how he transformed his farming operation into regenerative farming, and the money he saved, I mean, it's just staggering. And he gets away from fertilizers. And so, I mean, there are examples of people that have done that. And I can't remember the name of the gentleman up in North Dakota who is a champion of going regenerative. And he's appeared before Congress, and Gabe Brown.
Gabe
Yeah,
Brown.
Gabe Brown. Okay. And he is appeared before Congress, and he told them of what he's accomplished, and he's a real champion in that area. So and then I remember on the internet, there was a man in Georgia, a farmer down in Georgia, same thing. So the information is there, and the proof is there. It just has to be articulated and gotten through to the rest of the farming community, that so much can be done there. And then what is kind of frustrating, if the Biden administration is fostering all of this money to go this way, why can't a better network or framework be established to work this through? I mean, it seems like the parts are there, and they've been there for quite a while, and but it's not coalescing into something that is effective. So I'll just wrap that up, is that, you know, it seems like the proof is in the pudding. It's there. It's just got to be gotten out to the farming community through an effective network. So that's my comment.
Marx is another person who has accomplished a lot. He wrote the book Restoration Agriculture. Some of you probably read that. Anyway, he's been really successful by setting a Nature Valley. That's the name of their co-op, and they make zillions of dollars. So anyway, his book is really interesting. He's very pro as little labor as possible. But he's one more person to add to the coalition you were talking about, or the network you were talking.
Awesome. Thanks, Pamela.
Actually, I'd be interested in hearing from Paul since he's been doing a lot of this work on his farm. And Paul says, thanks a lot.
I just trying to find my unmute button. So anyway, yeah, thanks, Nancy. So the answer to Gary's questions is yes, yes, and yes, and yes. But the biggest hump for farmers to get over is between here and here. And that's a real challenge. The second biggest problem I found out there is landlords. Over 50% of farmland is rented, and landlords have been chasing money. They don't see the land as a stewardship thing. They see it as an economic. It's a class of capital, and capital returns money, and that's what they want off of it. They're ignorant of the fact that poorly managed land will be worth less 50 years from now than it is today. But hey, that's their grandkids' problem. And so there's landlords are a big problem in this mix in terms of them understanding, because most of these practices take 5 to 7 years of implementation before they start creating that self-fulfilling benefit. And so if you've got a landlord who wants to put the land up for bid every 2 years to the highest bidder in the neighborhood, it'll never work. And there's way too much of that. And farm management companies are as guilty of anybody. And so if I was going to go after anybody, I would go after farm management companies for dereliction of duty in managing their farmland that they're supposed to be managing for the long-term benefit of the owners. And because these do pay for themselves, though, but it takes, and Jenna pointed that out, it takes this time. And so that time lag, and in fact, for example, in converting to no-till, they'll generally recommend goosing your nitrogen fertilizer a little bit to move it along, or be willing to accept a little lower yield for those first few years. We've been doing it for close to 20 years now, so I'm struggling to remember. And we've gained a lot of knowledge about soil health in the last 10 years that I didn't have when I started no-tilling. We did it from economic standpoint, just as Gary is asking. Fewer passes. We only had, my dad had retired, but he retired and said, I'm not going to help you anymore. And so I lost a tractor driver, so it became down to how to manage it. So labor was part of it. And then over time, we've reduced our fertilizers, and we've been able to manage somewhat better our weed issues, although I'm not fully where I'd like to be with that. But so it does pay for itself, but it's getting over the hump, and it's getting landlords on board to help out with the bigger picture of this.
Great, thanks. Jenna, so all of these farms are farmer owned, right?
Yes, the ones that we currently work with are owned by the farmers. So we've tried to have conversations around that in the long-term program. We do have one farm now in the second cohort that has some rented land. So we'll be able to have conversations with them to understand, what would a contract look like, what could work and what could not work. So yeah, Paul, it's a really important point and something that affects a lot of farmers everywhere.
I just had a conversation with a landlord who called me and said, hey, I want to do this, but I don't think my tenant wants to do it. So that's the other part of the problem too. He would like to do some of this, and he was wondering what I'm doing and how he could talk with his tenant about adopting some of that and not being nervous about adopting practices. So anyway, there's two sides to every story, I guess.
Okay, well, we're past the top of the hour now. But I'd like to thank Jenna again for a terrific presentation. And as always, our team came through with lots of questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone it was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. I just wanted to say one last thing. Our next ag call will be a week early because otherwise it's going to be exactly when I'm lobbying, so in DC. And besides, we want to talk about lobbying resources and the Farm Bill. So put that in your calendar, June 4th. Thank you again, Jenna.
Yeah, no problem.
And
bye everyone. Thank you. Feel free to reach out if I'll set, or Nancy has my email. Bye everyone.
Yep.